Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. We're going to give everyone just one more minute to log in, and we will get started. Good morning. My name is Michelle Daling, and I'm the Director of Brand Protection at Track Street. I'm excited to partner with Jennifer Marsh and Michael Murphy of K&L Gates to bring you this webinar today to talk about what's permitted and what's not with the new go-to-market strategies with the new guidances that came out in the UK and Europe back in June. So I'm excited to get started and lean on their expertise in the space. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. Like I said, my name is Michelle Daling. I'm Director of Brand Protection here at Track Street. We also have Michael Murphy, partner at K&L Gates. He's here in the US outside of Boston. And we have Jennifer Marsh, who is located over in the UK and is an expert in this space. So first thing we want to talk about is the European approach to strategies, which are permissible in the US. So Michael is going to give us some context here as we set the table. Many of you know what's allowed in the US, but those laws are obviously different over in Europe. So we're going to make some similarities here so that you understand the basis of the US and how it's different over in Europe. So I'll pass it over to Michael.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everyone, for joining. As Michelle said, Michael Murphy, I'm an antitrust competition attorney in the US with K&L Gates, and I work exclusively with product manufacturers and all different verticals on the design and implementation of distribution strategies, pricing policies, authorization programs, all with really those goals of getting better control of your e-commerce sales, combating that online price erosion, and really having a strong legal foundation to effectively and aggressively go after and remove those unauthorized internet resellers that cause brands so many headaches out there in the marketplace. As Michelle said, today's focus is on the UK and the EU, but we thought it would be good because I know different people come from different backgrounds here, on what a lot of brands do in the US. And in reality, brands are very spoiled in the US, right? Because the laws are a lot more relaxed. Like I always think of the laws in this area on one side of the spectrum is the United States, where you can do a lot of stuff. And then on the other side of the spectrum really is the UK and the EU, and even Australia might even be a little further, but generally speaking in the US, what brands rely on, to deal with these issues are two main tools, right? One is that is of an authorization program, right? And in the United States, it's very nice because manufacturers can arbitrarily choose who's authorized and who's not. Manufacturers can arbitrarily choose who can sell online and who can't, right? In the United States, somebody can apply and say, I sell on my own site, eBay, Amazon, and a brand can arbitrarily say, that's great, we're going to authorize you for your own site, but no marketplaces. No further questions, no further inquiry, which is a very nice tool of getting control. As you're going to learn a little today, that's not necessarily true in the EU and the UK. The other major tool we have in the US are pricing policies, right? Everyone always wants to call their pricing policies MAP policies. In the US, there actually is still a lot of confusion over what constitutes a legal pricing policy and what is a unilateral policy versus what's a MAP policy. But in general, pricing policies are legal in the United States and a very effective tool. One of the big differences between the US and the UK and the EU is that pricing policies in the EU and the UK are not legal. So that's one tool we do not have when we're talking about getting control in the US or in the EU or the UK. So I just wanted to set a little background. At this point, I think we can turn it over to Jen, who can jump in on our expert who's based in London, who can really talk to us about pricing policies and why they cannot be used in the EU and the UK. Jen?
Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Michelle and the Track Street team for inviting us to speak today. Yes, thank you, Michael, for teeing up so well that and managing expectations, I think, is the key point when it comes to UK and Europe, because as Michael says, we are a lot more restricted here as to the available tools. So we wanted to start by looking at these key, you'll see them across the top of the screen there, MAP, price monitoring, authorized reseller programs, which we find that brands coming from the US are typically looking to rely on when they look to get some control of the consumer experience of their brand in UK and Europe, and talk about what that looks like here under our rules. So starting with MAP, with the minimum advertised pricing policy, I would say basically in general terms, this is not allowed. And this has also been confirmed in the new rules that were released to take effect on 1st of June that Michelle mentioned. It's essentially seen as a form of resale price maintenance. If you have a MAP policy, and resale price maintenance is essentially a per se illegal restriction here. And it's also hotly enforced. It's not just a sort of theoretical problem. I would say this is the kind of restriction where we see the authorities imposing the most fines. And also, perhaps as compared with the US, we have more public enforcement here in Europe. So we have all of the national authorities, including the UK authority, imposing fines in this space. And we also have the supranational European Commission. And what we see from all of them is fines imposed for resale price maintenance. And we've listed a few here. And another thing, I guess, to note about those cases is that you will often see some kind of electronic systemized monitoring and enforcement behind those fines as well. There's a real interest in taking cases where there is electronic program monitoring of pricing. So then if we look at the next slide on this, what can you do in the pricing space? Well, you can impose recommended resale prices here. So, you as a brand might well know your products the best, what the right market for your products is, what price the market is willing to pay, and therefore it is entirely appropriate for you to recommend as a brand to recommend a retail price. However, sorry.
And Jen, if I could just jump in here for, US-based people, this is what we would call an MSRP, right? Manufacturer suggested retail price, where you're just suggesting what it is. There's no policy, there's no enforcement behind it. You're just recommending what you believe that resale price should be in the marketplace.
Exactly. Thanks, Michael. But you can't, as Michael says, you can't back that MSRP, RRP up with sanctions for failure to comply or incentives to encourage compliance. You just sort of put it out there as a recommendation. You can fix a maximum resale price, so telling retailers not to price at more than a set level, but it mustn't be set so low that it in effect is a fixed price. Realistically, nobody is going to price any lower than that. That's not a maximum resale price, that's a fixed resale price. And then the last thing I would say, as you can see from the examples on the side there, we often get situations where a brand is providing support for a particular discount period, supporting a promotion. And if a brand is giving a discount on the wholesale price, they expect that to be flowed through to the consumer. So what can you do there if you can't require the resale price to be adhered to? Well, you need to phrase it as a maximum resale price. So you need to say, if I'm giving you a £10 discount off the product, I expect to see at least that amount passed through to the consumer. And that way it is a compliant maximum resale price rather than a fixed resale price. Next slide, please. Moving on to price monitoring. So we often see really great tools coming over from, particularly that have been developed in the US, on price monitoring, really systematic and up to date and up to the minute, and people are really excited to use them in Europe. And the message basically is you can use them, you know, particularly for things like establishing what the right retail price is, what the right recommended retail price is. Also, if you as a brand are selling direct to consumer, of course you need to understand the right pricing. Maybe you want to respond if other retailers or other products are moving as well. So it is perfectly legitimate. That's again been confirmed in the recent rules that were issued to take effect on 1st of June. But you can't use it to enforce a resale price maintenance policy or to make people adhere to something that's positioned as an MSRP. It has to be used for those sort of informational purposes. And as we were mentioning, we really do see a lot of this price. The authorities seem really keen to take cases and make an example of people who are misusing price monitoring in that way. So the biggest fines perhaps were in the Advertised on Philips and Pioneer. That was sort of household appliances, hairdryers and so on. The notebook tablets that you might be taking notes on now even, that was subject to a resale price maintenance policy enforced with price monitoring. And there were really significant fines there, altogether 111 million euros, I think it was. So it's really fined at the most severe level. So use price monitoring tools, but be careful you're using them correctly, and the people in your organization who have access to them understand how they should be used, I would say.
And we do now have those capabilities to scrape Europe and the UK, so we can definitely provide visibility into that data in order to inform strategies moving forward.
And Michelle, to that point and to Jen's point, right, there's a lot of pro-competitive and good reasons why you want to track pricing, right, in Europe and the UK. But you cannot use it, obviously, as Jen said, to enforce a pricing policy, which would be illegal. But the other point I want to hit on, because I know a lot of brands do this in the US, and I don't love the strategy itself, and I think it raises some concerns, but where, you know, a brand will focus or prioritize unauthorized reseller enforcement only on people below their MAP price. Right now, I'm okay with that if, you know, that's your priority, that's where you're starting, but, you know, you should be going after anyone who's unauthorized. And the key in my point here is in Europe and the UK, that's even more important, right? If you have, and I know Jen hasn't talked about authorized reseller programs yet in the EU and the UK, but if you properly set up an authorization program and then you're only enforcing it against unauthorized resellers in Europe and the UK below whatever you believe your MSRP or MAP price is, that's going to raise a red flag and can really get you in trouble. So it's just something to be aware of, you know, when Jen talks about the authorized reseller program.
Thank you. Yes, let's move on to that final tool, sort of typical US tool, I think, the authorized reseller programs. Again, this is like price monitoring. Basically, it's allowed, you can do it. Where you get into trouble, and what we see happening sometimes is a US style authorized reseller program being sort of picked up and people seeking to apply it here without appropriate amendments. You know, we'll talk about it some more in a second, but basically it's a great tool, an authorized reseller program. It's the tool really for controlling who sells your products and what the consumer experience is of them. But you have to do it in a consistent way by reference to established criteria. It can't be reactive where you sort of identify a problem in a particular channel, say, and then just have an authorized reseller program for that channel. And basically, I would say I've seen a lot of US agreements, including excellent ones drafted by Michael, and I've never seen one that is appropriate just to be picked up and applied in UK and Europe without amendment.
And Jen, that's a very good point, because we see it a lot where a brand, you know, has some success with a program in the US and they say, oh, this is great, not knowing that they're even doing anything improper or illegal. They just repackage whatever that program is for the EU or the UK, and they really begin to run afoul with laws over there. So one, it's just the knowledge of the laws are different, right? And Jen's going to expand further in this presentation on on really how you properly set up an authorized reseller program, because you can do it and it can be extremely effective, but you need to do it the proper way.
Thank you. So yeah, if we could go on to the next section, we've talked about, we've tried to position the first section as the pitfalls of just sort of picking up your US policy and applying it in UK and Europe. To try and be a bit more focused on the solutions in the second section, we wanted to start thinking about what the tools are. And basically the most effective, most comprehensive tool is an authorized reseller program or a selective distribution system. Because if you don't have a selective distribution system, if you have open distribution here in UK and Europe, you basically have to allow resale to whoever. Once you sell your product to, say, a distributor in UK or Europe, they have to be free to sell it to whomever they choose, retailer or consumer, and you lose control. So it's a lot of work to implement a selective distribution system here, because it has to be done across all your channels. It can be done in some territories and not in others as of 1st of June. So you don't have to do it all around Europe, all in one go. But you have to do it across all channels in a consistent way. And if somebody doesn't meet your criteria, then you shouldn't be dealing with them. So that's, that is a real challenge. And getting your authorized dealers, the people you do want to work with, signed up to a selective distribution agreement, again, is a lengthy onboarding process. And I know, again, this is the kind of area where TrackStreet can help sort of reduce some of the administrative burden. But if you do go through that process, then what you've got is a really great tool, a legally compliant tool, and therefore enforceable tool for controlling who sells your product and making sure they meet certain minimum standards as to how they're displaying your product, how they're delivering your product, how they're dealing with complaints, what kind of pre-sales, after sales support they're offering, how quickly they're dealing with consumers, how technically expert their websites are, and the functionality of the website, of the chat function, whatever. You will get control over all of that if you implement a selective distribution system. I would say in terms of the limitations of a selective distribution system, once somebody's authorized, you can't mandate where they get their product from. So if you authorize, a bunch of retailers in Germany that you're happy meet the criteria, a bunch of retailers in Poland, you're not then able to stop the cross sales between authorized partners. So you could still get, Polish retailers selling to German retailers, for instance. It's a closed system, and then there has to be freedom of cross sales within that closed system. Another big advantage of a selective distribution system is that it enables you to exclude any third-party marketplaces that you may feel don't match the prestige or the technical requirements of your brand. Maybe most people want their product to be on Amazon, but there might be other sites that aren't so desirable. We've got a whole list of common offenders here, or the sort of less popular sites. Often there's, Allegro in Poland, or people have different views about Bol in the Netherlands. eBay is a more common one. There's also some very specific marketplaces up in Scandinavia that aren't sort of the usuals that you hear from the US. And so you can pick out those third-party marketplaces, and you could even, in most circumstances, have a ban on third-party marketplace selling altogether if that's what you wanted. And we find that tends to give brands much tighter control of how their product's being sold in the way they're looking for.
Awesome. Jen, I just want to hit on, the main difference between authorization programs in the US and the EU. And I mentioned it up front, but, I just want to make sure it's clear to everyone listening that, it's just a lot easier in the US, right? Because we can arbitrarily come up with an authorization program and decide, who's authorized and who's not. Now, a lot of brands, even in the US, have some criteria they use in making these decisions, but it's not required, right? You can just arbitrarily choose. The difference in the EU and the UK, as Jen says, and I always refer to these authorization programs specifically as selective distribution, right, criteria, because you as a brand need to create a list of objective criteria. And then once you set that list of objective criteria, if a retailer meets it, then they're authorized to sell your product. If they don't meet it, then they're not authorized to sell your product. So, it leaves some of that selecting, I want you, I don't want you. It really lies in what that criteria is. And our team works with a lot of brands to really develop that criteria in a way, to maximize who you want in and who you want out, based on objective criteria.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Michael. I mean, it's so your criteria is so important. We always find with these systems, if they're a document that the legal team came up with, maybe even us with an in-house legal person, they're not as good as they could have been if the business gets involved, because the business, the sales team are the ones that need to live by those criteria. They can't just exist in a legal document, and if they do, then the system's not going to work. It's you set a criterion. Are you happy that you're not going to sell to anyone who doesn't meet that criterion? I mean, maybe there's a little flex sometimes where you can, say you require a particular approval rating of sort of 90% and somebody dips below, and you can give them a grace period to get it back up again or what have you. But basically, you're going to have to live by those criteria. So you need to get really comfortable with them. I mean, we sometimes get really complicated with our systems, and we might have multiple tiers. So, keep it simple, bronze, silver, gold, and you might have the lowest level criteria for bronze, and the most and allow the most basic products to be sold at that level, maybe slightly older products, and going up to sort of silver and gold and have the highest requirements there, which gives you more flex. Or people introduce more tiers over time sometimes. But yeah, I mean, as well as the tiers, you also will often have a set of criteria for your bricks and mortar resellers, a set of criteria for your internet D2C retailers, and then you might even have a third set, or at least a few additional criteria that apply in relation to third-party marketplaces. So you might exclude some third-party marketplaces altogether, and then you might have, in relation to the marketplaces that aren't excluded, a few additional criteria as to what you're looking for. Maybe you're going to require tighter controls over fulfillment, to make sure that you're excluding those sort of bedroom resellers from your network that generally sort of sometimes trade in products rather than sort of investing in the brand. But anyway, so I would say it's a lot of work, an authorized reseller program in Europe, but we find, having worked with a number of brands on designing them, rolling them out, implementing them, this is what enables us to take the most comprehensive action against undesirable partners, to give the brand more control over every stage of their distribution network. And the other main tool I wanted to focus on at this stage, if we could just go to the next slide, is D2C Selling, which is in some ways an obvious one, but of course there's no way of controlling your how your products are sold more than D2C. I would include in this, for instance, any agency model. If you appoint agents where you sort of have the risk for how they're selling, as well as wholly owned outlets, you're going to have control over everything: who they sell to, what price it's sold at, how long they sell products for, when they're withdrawn, when promotions happen, and so on. And we have, maybe because of our more restrictive legal regime, we often see brands launch with a D2C strategy and retain that much longer than maybe they would do or have done in the US to retain that control. And it doesn't really raise any issue under these competition laws that we're talking about, because competition law, antitrust law, doesn't bite on intra-group arrangements. So an agreement between maybe the US parent company and the EU subsidiary on pricing and sales and all of these parameters of how they operate in the market doesn't fall within the scope of competition law. So there's not even a question mark over whether it's legal or it's not. it's, yeah, I would only caution that as of 1st of June, there is, if you're doing B2B as well, so maybe, for instance, a brand might launch with D2C, really hold on to that strategy for a couple of years, but then start running B2B alongside it. So appointing distributors, maybe for territories or for channels that it's found harder to reach. Or what we see increasingly is people having operated a traditional distributor, retailer, consumer strategy, but post-pandemic being really keen on growing their D2C presence, growing their D2C site and so on. You then have technically channels that are in competition with each other, because if your D2C website is selling your product and you're selling your product through a distribution network, technically those two channels should be in competition with each other. So what you see in the rules is a real encouragement of limits on information sharing between the two channels. Ideally, I'm sure what the European Commission, what the UK Competition and Markets Authority would have required is a wholly separate team to run a D2C offering versus the team at the brand that liaises with the distributors, decides if the brand's offering promotional support, etc. Now, that's not always going to be possible, but I think they will expect to see some separation of decision making. It shouldn't be, for instance, that your D2C website is only running promotions at exactly the same time as your independent retailers. Everyone might run a Black Friday sale, everyone might run a July sale, but you shouldn't be sort of coordinating on the precise dates, how long it's going to run, what the product range that's subject to the discount is, how deep the discount's going to be. Those should be independent decisions, I guess, is what the competition authorities have now clarified that they're looking to see. Another area on D2C where we get a lot of questions is sort of the limits of D2C, in particular concessions. So I think most people are probably familiar with, department store, Harrods in London might have all sorts of brand concessions, especially sort of the ground floor reception area. You go through all of the makeup, perfume, handbag counters. Is that an independent retailer selling, or that you can't control and you can't tell them what level to price at? Or is that a concession that's owned and controlled by the brand, and therefore the brand can stipulate the prices and so on? And really it depends. It depends on the agreement, who's employing those staff. Is there a rental agreement effectively for that space? What happens with unsold stock? Who's got the risk of the unsold stock? The more the risk is with the brand, the more they're going to be able to control pricing and so on. And I guess that's sort of the traditional question, but increasingly in the digital age, we get questions about if an e-concession is a true e-concession. Is a site just hosting a page for a brand to sell? So you sort of get all the advantages of a department store online because you get the extra traffic going to the site and so on, but it's not the site that's selling, it's just hosting a page for brands to sell on. Again, it will come down to specifics about how the agreement works, but those are the questions that arise when you're sort of getting to the limits of D2C selling.
Hey, Jen, one thing I just wanted to hit on was when you talked about dual distribution, because it's not as big of an issue in the US, but it is an issue in the US. And I think a lot of people struggle with it because they say, oh, I have a D2C site, I'm only maybe doing, 2 or 3% of our total volume of sales on our D2C site. And then I sell through distribution and retailers and so forth. But when you're selling to consumers and your retailers are selling to consumers, under antitrust or competition law, there is an element of, that's a horizontal relationship, or your customer is now also a competitor, right? And it can create a very strange dynamic under the law. In the US, the law isn't really that developed, and a lot of courts actually look at the primary relationship. If you're primarily a customer, then they'll treat you as a customer, which is good for brands because it's a much lower threshold and standard. However, my understanding in the EU and UK, they're going to look at that relationship depending on what capacity it's in as either a competitive relationship or, a customer relationship, or what we always say, a horizontal relationship or a vertical relationship. So I just want to point that out. Mostly every brand, today has some form of both, right? D2C and distribution. So, even in the US, it's probably much lower risk, but there are things you should think about, when you're sharing information about what you're doing on your D2C site with your retailers, because it could raise flags and could trigger antitrust concerns.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, I would say under the new, as I mentioned, we've got a lot more guidance, shall we call it, on this area as of 1st of June. And I would say the key question is, if you look at a particular information exchange between the brand and its distributor or the brand and its retailer, was that information exchange necessary for the relationship of supply? So, for instance, asking the retailer giving information about an upcoming promotion because they want the brand to support it is probably justified in the context of that supply relationship. But if they're just talking about upcoming promotions for the sake of sort of coordinating and good relations between the two of them, then that's not necessary for the supply relationship. So I think it's a similar question to, it sounds like what you have in the US, but it's, is the information exchange necessary in the context of the supply relationship? Thank you. So if we could move on to the next section, there is, we wanted to talk basically about the new opportunities, because even if I guess a bit or even a lot about UK and European rules before 1st of June, there might be a few additional nuances that you're not so aware of. And hopefully we can hit on a few additional tools that might be useful to you if you're thinking or rethinking about how to manage your brand in UK or Europe. So the first point is resale price maintenance exceptions. So I mentioned that resale price maintenance is basically per se illegal here. It's hotly enforced. It's highly likely to lead to fines. There are some really helpful, or at least helpful looking exceptions in the new guidance. So there's discussion of resale price maintenance, as in stipulating a resale price, potentially being permitted in these circumstances. So in the context of a temporary pricing campaign after a product launch, so maybe a product's just been launched and you want to establish a certain market price for the product, and if that's short-lived and it enables you to launch the product in a more sort of effective way, that it's more likely to stay on the market, maybe there are consumer benefits and maybe that might work. Also, a short-term low price campaign. I think they've particularly got in mind here a sort of franchise, maybe, where it makes sense that everyone, if everyone within a franchise is advertising the low price at the same time, under the same branding, then even though they're not all part of one group, it's not a sort of parent subsidiary relationship, there are advantages to that, and in particular with consumers being aware of the campaign and so on, so that maybe that should be permitted. Protection against free riding. So if there's a really high investment required to make a sale, maybe we've worked for a golf club manufacturer previously where arguably you need, and I certainly feel you need, a dynamic face-to-face custom fitting before you could sell a properly fitted golf club, and that's a sort of expert service. It's time intensive, it's high cost, and query if you should be allowed to have your sort of free custom fitting and then go on the internet and buy a cheaper club. And if you can show that resale price maintenance is really your only tool to combat that kind of aggressive free riding, then maybe it's going to be permitted in that circumstance.
Hey, Jen, can I jump in here too? Because I just, with the new rules, I've had actual clients call me and say, Michael, I heard there's new EU rules on pricing policies and they're legal now. And I just want to be extremely clear that that is not the case, right? I mean, it's a positive development in a sense that I think the EU Competition Commission is, moving a little bit, looking at some of these extremely limited exceptions, but overall, any form of resale price maintenance in the EU or the UK is still considered per se illegal. So I just want to be very clear there. You may fit under one of these limited exceptions, right, that Jen's talking about, but even doing one of these limited exceptions, you're going to be taking on some risk. So you want to make sure, it's measured, you talk to counsel, and you know what that is. But still, generally speaking, all forms of resale price maintenance in Europe and the UK are considered illegal.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think maybe I was taking a bit long, wasn't I, Michael, to get to the point that even then we're not advising everybody to do all of these things, because as you say, the Commission has put these in the guidance, so is the CMA in the UK, but we're really skeptical about whether they're going to work. You see them in the guidance and you think, well, if they're in the guidance, then technically this should be possible. But there's still, you would have the criteria you have to meet to satisfy one of these exceptions. So you have to show, and you might have heard me talking about the sort of benefits to consumers. So we need to show a clear consumer benefit really to what you're doing here. And crucially, I think we need to show that there's no less anti-competitive alternative. So, yeah.
I was just going to say, and that's the struggle with these, right? Because at the end of the day, there's no real safe harbor, right? It's going to become a fact-intensive analysis. And by the way, the burden is going to be on you to show that it's more pro-competitive than anti-competitive. And the last thing you want to do is have the Competition Commission open up an investigation, because at the end of the day, even if you win, you're going to lose after legal fees and all of that. So, not saying you can't do one of these, but you really want to think and be strategic.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the example I gave of the free riding, if you ask yourself the question, is there really no less anti-competitive way of doing this than imposing a resale price maintenance policy? That's a really high burden to satisfy. For instance, couldn't you impose put in place a selective distribution system to make sure that everyone is making the same kind of investments? And we know that some of the competition authorities are going to be really aggressive in how they enforce this. Even if the European Commission has drafted this guidance, but we fully expect the German competition authority is, the most restrictive, and we would fully expect them to sort of challenge one of these policies and to be interested in taking a case, notwithstanding what the guidance in the European Commission document is. But I didn't quite get to the last example to think about how that might work. And this is the one that's really brand new under the 2022 rules, is loss leader protection. So this is where maybe a retailer is selling product below the wholesale price. I know for a lot of brands that doesn't even come up. It's not that they're selling at a level that makes a loss. It's that they're selling a level where they're really making a tiny margin. But we do see it. Sometimes maybe a retail business is struggling, and in order to get maybe short-term cash flow, they might do a loss leader promotion. And if you do get to that point where somebody's selling below wholesale price, which might be a tiny set of circumstances, we think that this is perhaps of the four, the one maybe that would be most defensible to impose an RPM policy to protect. But again, there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of evidence should be gathered to demonstrate why one of these policies was necessary before you look to roll it out.
And practically, that can be a real world example now, right? In certain verticals, there's inventory backups and pile ups, and you read stories of some of the retailers, dumping out products. So that's something that we could see in the coming months.
Thank you. So we want to talk about dual pricing. I think by this point, you will have understood that we basically see pricing policies as illegal here in Europe. So why am I saying dual pricing is an opportunity under the new rules? Well, this is about wholesale pricing. So there are opportunities since 1st of June 2022 to get, I would say, a bit smarter about how you set your wholesale price. So what a lot of brands are starting to look at, maybe even roll out, is a performance pricing policy. Basically, a retailer will get a better price from you if they give more back to the brand. It can be used as an alternative to the very intensive selective distribution systems that we've talked about, or it can be an add-on to a selective distribution system. But basically, you're looking to reward similar kind of behavior so that you might have rewarded in the context of a selective distribution system. And crucially, you can say that a bricks and mortar store is giving you more back as a brand, that they're showcasing your products at expense to themselves, because we all know that bricks and mortar is expensive. So they're showcasing your product, they're enabling consumers to touch and feel product, to maybe even test them before they buy, and that is an advantage that can't be replicated online, and therefore you are giving the bricks and mortar store the better price, the better wholesale price, and supporting all of their costs relative to the online store. There might still be online behaviors that you want to reward. When people say somebody runs a promotion, maybe that's sort of suggested gifts for a department store website or what have you, and they feature your product in those suggested gifts. For instance, maybe that's behavior that you want to reward that is again online. But the real opportunity now is that you can give the best pricing to bricks and mortar in a way, and just say that online is not capable of offering the level of brand support that bricks and mortar is, and that's where the difference is justified. I would say though that we wouldn't encourage arbitrary price differences. There's no general obligation to offer the same price to all retailers unless you've got an extremely high market share, unless you could be considered dominant. But I always encourage brands to roll out a policy and to think about in a sort of more systematic way about which behaviors they're seeking to reward, and sort of set some parameters around that. It's great if you can pin it back to investments the reseller might be making. For instance, if they've got a bricks and mortar store in a premium location, certainly London retail areas don't come cheap, and that might be the best showcase for your products, and you might want to reward that. And also the limit of this that's set out in the guidance is that it shouldn't make online selling unfeasible. So yes, you can have a higher wholesale price for the online sale, but it shouldn't be so high that will realistically that retailer is not going to sell online. They're only going to sell bricks and mortar. And as I cautioned, this is, the European guidance is also copied in the UK guidance, but we are waiting with bated breath to see how the more aggressive authorities like Germany might interpret this. So I would say extra caution if you're rolling something out in Germany, or if it's, maybe it's got your product has a particularly high profile in Germany, then basically we tend to get these things double checked by our colleagues in Berlin. Okay, and then coming back to selective distribution, are there any new opportunities under the new rules in relation to selective distribution? I would basically, again, it comes back to a slight rolling back of the protection that the European Commission has been giving online. So, the previous rules came into effect in 2010, and at that time, the perception was still online is this nascent channel that nobody wants to deal with, and we need to be very protective and make sure that that all of the brands are giving good access to the internet and so on. Now post-pandemic 2022 rules acknowledge that bricks and mortar is really struggling, bricks and mortar is really high cost, bricks and mortar has something unique to offer brands often. And so here in relation to selective distribution, it's now clear that you can have higher criteria for internet than you might have for bricks and mortar. There used to be a strict rule about having, I mentioned earlier that you might well have separate criteria for bricks and mortar versus online, because it wouldn't make sense to talk about latency time in relation to a bricks and mortar store. But there used to be a real requirement that you're showing parity across the two channels. you have requirements for a high quality website, just like you will have requirements for a high quality bricks and mortar store. That obsession with sort of parity has basically fallen away in the 2022 rules. So there's now more flexibility to diverge in what you might have in the bricks and mortar criteria set versus what you might have in the online set. And again, more clarity around these marketplace sales restrictions. We had a case here in 2017 for Coty, who make makeup and so on. And it was established that it was the beginning of the rowing back, I would say, of protection of the internet, that you can stop sales on a marketplace. So if you think that it's not consistent with your brand to allow sales on a third-party marketplace, you can just outright prevent third-party marketplace sales, as long as you're not talking about a territory where basically people only buy via a marketplace. And that's all set out now in the commission guidance, and sort of pretty clear. And also the argument on the Coty case back in 2017 was that, well, really these are luxury products. So does the same analysis apply for non-luxury goods? You know, can you really say in relation to, you know, I don't know, a child's toy, does that really need the same level of protection where a brand can choose not to sell in a marketplace? And basically the guidance is that you can, if you've got a modest market share, not higher than 30%, then you, regardless, you do not have to show that your products are of a luxury nature in order to have this kind of marketplace sales restriction. Okay, and then the last, I would say, area of opportunity that we wanted to cover from the 2022 rules is exclusivity. Exclusivity we like often to put in place in UK and Europe because it is the tool that enables some restriction on cross-border selling. So if you have an exclusive, and this has always been the case even before 2022, if you have, say, an exclusive partner in France, and you allocate that territory to your partner exclusively, no one else, you're not selling to anyone else and permitting them to sell into France, then you can block cross-border selling. So you can tell your German distributor, you mustn't market to the French consumers, to French retail partners, because the French distributor has that territory. Although it was very difficult to fall into that category because you really had to pick one partner. You shouldn't really technically even be selling yourself on a D2C website if you're claiming to have allocated a territory exclusively to that one other partner. There is a lot more flexibility in the 2022 rules. So basically the commission is saying you could have up to 5 exclusive partners, shared exclusivity amongst 5 partners. And that would still be something that you could protect from the active cross-border selling. You know, if a French consumer is determined to go on the .de website and buy from a German retail partner, you're not going to be able to stop them. But you can stop the active selling, the active marketing from, in that example, Germany into France.
And Jen, if I could, I mean, this is a really good tool, right? And I don't know what everyone's background is, but you know, generally speaking, in the European Union, you can't stop the transfer of products from one country to another or one member state to another. This use of exclusivity allows you to stop some of that at least, right? And, you know, we talk about Brexit as well, right? Why this isn't just EU, it's EU, UK, because now UK is no longer part of the European Union. So, you know, you can prohibit that. And then if you're doing, you know, some form of exclusivity in certain countries within the European Union, you may be able to prohibit those active sales into those countries. And then it used to just be one, as Jen said, now you can have multiple exclusive sellers. So again, it just moves a little further to allow you to do a little bit more to control where your products are going in the European Union.
And Michael, does that also apply for those exclusive territories for those retailers to be selling back into the United States, or is that separate?
So completely separate. You can always, in the European Union or UK, prohibit sales outside of the European Union, right? So that's always something you can do. It's something we see a lot in the United States, right? Where an international seller or a European seller is selling on Amazon.com, to the US market. What can you do? Now, there's a lot of things you can do if you set up the proper foundation, right? If you have an appropriate US authorization program, right, that's going to apply to the European seller because it's not where the seller's from, it's where those active sales in the market that they're putting themselves into is happening. But it makes it even stronger, if company-wide you have a selective distribution program in Europe, or at least T's and C's that prohibit that European retailer from selling outside of the European Union. It's funny, these are the issues of why I ended up at K&L Gates. I used to do a lot of this work at another firm, on a national level and a North America level. And, we came over to K&L to really build out a global team to have great folks like Jen, running a team in Europe. We do it in Asia. But, these things really work well when you have a global strategy and not just a continent strategy or a country strategy. But there are a lot of things you can do, in this area. And there are no restrictions, even in the EU, on prohibiting sales outside of the EU.
Great. Well, I know we wanted to leave a couple minutes for questions. So I guess just quickly to finish on exclusivity, the other point under the new rules is that it's much easier to flow down those cross-border sales restrictions. So rather than just saying, to the German distributor, don't sell into France, you can now get the German distributor to tell the German retailers not to sell into France. So that makes things a bit more effective. And then I guess I would just caution about combining selective distribution with exclusive distribution. This has got a lot trickier basically since June 2022. And in particular, there are question marks over having an exclusive distributor at the wholesale level and then a selective distribution system at the retail level. You just have to put it's again one of those situations, a bit like the RPN exceptions, where you need to put more work into explaining why that was really necessary. At least under the European rules, that's actually one area where there's divergence with UK, and UK has said it's fine to have an exclusive wholesaler and selective distribution at the retail level. But anyway, I will stop there and hand back to Michelle for any questions.
Thank you. So we have a Q&A that's open. If you open the chat and you have any questions that you want to ask right now, we'll be happy to answer those. We did have a few pre-submitted questions that came in as we were preparing for this webinar. So the first question is Europe more restrictive than the US? And I thought dual pricing and price discrimination was illegal in the US. Is that right?
Oh, you're on mute, Mike.
I can start with this one. I mean, generally speaking, Europe is, in the antitrust competition world, Europe is usually always more restrictive than the US. The only spot it's not is with price discrimination, right? The US has a statute called the Robinson-Patman Act, which essentially says a manufacturer has to sell to retailers who compete against each other at or about the same price. A similar statute does not exist in Europe or really, anywhere else in the world that I'm aware of. Now, with that said, as Jen hit on during this presentation, there are some rules in Europe around dual pricing, but I do not think, any other regions of the world is as strict as the US under the Robinson-Patman Act. Now, the nice thing is, up until recently, the US government hasn't enforced the Robinson-Patman Act, but there is talk now at the DOJ and the FTC of actually dusting it off and looking at brands and pricing strategies and using it again. But with that said, there is a private right of action. So brands do need to be careful about the Robinson-Patman Act because you could be sued by a distributor or a dealer or even possibly in some form of a class action.
Thank you. The next question is, we just want to authorize resellers on marketplaces. Not all are brick and mortar and D2C internet resellers. Can we do that?
I'm sure this, oh, go on,
I was just going to say, in the US, yes. Different answer in Europe.
Thanks. That makes my answer all the more depressing. No, this is the point about you need to be consistent. You can't just be seen to be having a problem with marketplaces. You know, if your product merits selective distribution, if you feel that that's what's right for your brand, then the argument would go, you should think it's worth it on all channels, not just marketplaces.
And I'll even add to that. I mean, I never recommend just an internet marketplace authorization program, because practically, I think it just leaves way too many holes in your distribution to begin with. And then I think, to Jen's point, even in the US legally, it's just not as strong as an authorization program, or a foundation. So we generally at the smallest level would never recommend anything less than some form of an internet authorization program in the United States.
I agree. The next question is, can you apply to the European enforcement agencies for approval on a pricing policy?
Right. I mean, it might be what's had in mind here is there is such a process, I believe, in Australia where you can get, and I believe our colleagues have even had one of these examples where they've got a pricing policy blessed by the ACCC there. In Europe, there is a mechanism for getting your policies blessed or for applying for guidance on specific issues, but it's not generally used. The agencies have discretion as to whether to take the case. Depending on the exact agency, they might well publish it. So you have to be willing to sort of fully open your book as to what you're proposing and then see it published. It's just not something many people do because of all the restrictions.
Thank you. On exclusivity, can we have channel exclusives, like an exclusive partner on a given marketplace?
So in Europe, you could appoint someone and say, I'm not going to appoint anyone else on Amazon, but you couldn't really stop other resellers ending up on Amazon. So it wouldn't really be effective. Because you can't stop the cross-selling, you can't stop other people getting the product and then choosing to be on Amazon.
But you could try to limit it through a selective distribution authorization program.
Yeah, you could say you can't be on Amazon unless you're authorized to be, and that your Amazon point of sale is authorized, not just that you've got an authorization to sell bricks and mortar or sell on the D2C website. Do you have the authorization to be on that marketplace? Yeah.
And the last question that we had that was pre-submitted is, if price monitoring can't be used to enforce a MAP policy in Europe, then what are the legitimate uses? And I like this because obviously we're taking a look at helping our partners have some visibility into Europe. So help us out with this one.
Yeah, I mean, we work with brands all the time who are price monitoring over here and find it a really effective tool for keeping track, especially as they launch in additional territories and sort of learning maybe from one territory before they go into the other. Also, when they're preparing to launch a new product and trying to understand what the right price point for that new product is. Also, if in terms of setting their wholesale pricing, how much margin are they leaving for their retailers? Also for D2C selling, there are any number of legitimate uses. It's just you need to make sure that you're not enforcing by reference to it. You're not telling people if they're pricing at too low, then they're going to get cut off. Or you only enforce against unauthorized distributors who are below MSRP. You can't use it like that.
And then we had one question come in through the chat, and that is, you mentioned price monitoring going in a positive direction. Do you think it will continue to get less and less restrictive, or do you think this is the last change for the foreseeable future?
I think I don't think it's going to get any better. I think it's good that the commission has specifically said that price monitoring is not in and of itself illegal. I think that's helpful clarification, but we're still going to see even more enforcement in a situation where there's an illegal policy that's backed up by price monitoring. I think that's going to change anytime soon.
And Jen, when's the next time the commission will review the competition rules? Is that like an every 10-year thing?
For the commission, it's 2034, so it's another 12 years. In the UK, it's actually going to be reviewed in 2028, so they can take stock as to what impact Brexit has had and us leaving the European Union and so on.
So is it fair to say that no material changes would be made until those timeframes and dates?
And even then.
Yeah, even that would be a stretch.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today to join us to discuss the new guidelines in the EU and UK. And Jennifer and Michael, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise in this space. If you guys have any questions following this webinar, you can reach out to us via email. We would be happy to answer those for you. So with that, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.